The promise of retaining a sharp, agile mind well into the later decades of life is not merely a hopeful sentiment, but a biological reality grounded in the principles of neuroplasticity. For generations, the prevailing narrative suggested that the aging brain inevitably deteriorates, losing neurons and cognitive capacity as a fixed consequence of time. This fatalistic view ignores the robust capacity of the nervous system to rewire itself, forge new connections, and maintain high-level function when provided with specific physiological signals. By shifting focus from passive aging to active neural management, an individual can leverage specific protocols to preserve memory and processing speed. The approach detailed here moves beyond general advice and examines the distinct neurochemical and structural mechanisms that govern brain health. It integrates the perspective of neurobiology to offer a structured path for maintaining cognitive vitality. Triggering the neuroplastic switch, the adult brain possesses a latent ability to reorganize itself. But this process requires a specific chemical cocktail to initiate the changes associated with learning and memory retention. Neuroplasticity in adulthood is not a passive state that occurs constantly, but rather a gated event that must be deliberately triggered through focused effort and specific neurochemical states. The primary driver for opening this gate is the release of acetylcholine from the nucleus basalis and other neural clusters, which acts as a spotlight to mark specific active neurons for strengthening. This release occurs most reliably during periods of intense, dedicated focus, where the individual pushes against the boundaries of their current understanding or ability. The sensation of strain or mental friction experienced during these moments is not a sign of failure, but the necessary signal for the nervous system to recognize that change is required. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that the feeling of agitation or frustration during a learning bout is actually the release of norepinephrine, which alerts the brain, followed by acetylcholine, which focuses the brain. Without this neurochemical alert system, the neural circuits remain dormant and unchanged, continuing to fire in their habitual patterns without modification. The individual who seeks to maintain a sharp memory must therefore court this sensation of mental effort rather than avoid it, understanding that ease and comfort are the enemies of neural adaptation. High alert states signal to the nervous system that the current information is critical for survival or success, thereby marking the associated synapses for later reinforcement. This mechanism explains why passive activities like watching television or casual reading rarely result in significant long-term structural changes in the brain. A practical application of this principle involves designating specific 90-minute cycles for intense cognitive work or skill acquisition, separated by periods of rest. During these bouts, the individual engages in a task that requires total attention, such as learning a new language, mastering a complex motor skill, or studying a dense subject. The key is to eliminate all distractions, as the depth of focus directly correlates with the magnitude of the acetylcholine release and the subsequent potential for plasticity. If the attention drifts, the individual gently but firmly brings it back to the task, and this very act of refocusing strengthens the neural circuits involved in voluntary attention control. It is within these windows of high friction that the brain is primed to alter its structure, provided the effort is sustained long enough to trigger the chemical cascade. Many people mistakenly believe that they must remain in a state of high focus all day to keep their brains sharp, leading to burnout and cognitive fatigue. However, the neurobiological reality is that the brain can only sustain this type of high-intensity focus for limited durations before the neurochemical supplies are depleted. Attempting to force focus beyond these natural limits results in diminishing returns and can increase stress hormones to levels that are detrimental rather than helpful. A more effective strategy relies on shorter, highly intense bouts of concentration followed by deliberate disengagement. This pulse-like approach honors the metabolic constraints of the nervous system while ensuring that the signal for plasticity is strong and unambiguous. The process of learning and memory formation does not conclude when the period of intense focus ends. In fact, the actual rewiring happens later. The intense focus merely marks the neurons, but the strengthening of connections occurs during periods of deep rest and sleep. Therefore, the individual who prioritizes constant activity without adequate downtime undermines the very process they're trying to cultivate. It is during the quiet moments that the brain consolidates the information, moving it from temporary storage to more permanent neural architecture. This underscores the importance of decoupling the stress of learning from the rest of the day, allowing the nervous system to toggle between high alert and deep calm states. A common counterexample to this protocol is the individual who engages in constant multitasking or low-level partial attention throughout the day. While this person may feel busy and mentally active, they fail to generate the sufficient neurochemical threshold required to trigger plasticity. The brain remains in a state of mild engagement that consumes energy but does not signal the need for structural adaptation. Furthermore, the constant switching of context dilutes the release of acetylcholine, preventing any single neural circuit from being highlighted strongly enough for modification. This scattered approach leads to a subjective feeling of fatigue without the objective benefit of cognitive reinforcement or skill acquisition. Furthermore, relying solely on passive brain training games or repetitive puzzles often fails to produce generalized cognitive benefits because the brain quickly adapts to the specific task. Once the friction and challenge disappear, the neuroplastic trigger is turned off, and the activity becomes merely a performance of an existing habit. To maintain a sharp brain in later life, the individual must perpetually seek out novel challenges that induce that specific feeling of awkwardness and strain. It is the pursuit of the unknown, rather than the mastery of the familiar, that keeps the machinery of neuroplasticity functional and robust. Ultimately, the capacity to learn and remember is not lost with age, but is often neglected due to a lack of sufficient stimulus and the avoidance of mental discomfort. By reframing frustration as a chemical signal for growth, the individual takes agency over their cognitive trajectory. The willingness to engage in bouts of intense, singular focus serves as the lever that activates the machinery of the mind. This proactive stance ensures that the neural networks remain dynamic, responsive, and capable of supporting complex thought well into the future. Where am I avoiding the mental friction that signals growth? Restoration and the clearance of metabolic waste, while the trigger for learning occurs during waking hours. The actual solidification of memory and the physical maintenance of the brain occur almost exclusively during sleep. Andrew Huberman frequently highlights the critical role of the glymphatic system, a macroscopic waste clearance system that utilizes perivascular channels to eliminate soluble proteins and metabolites from the central nervous system. This cleansing process is most active during deep, slow-wave sleep, where the brain cells effectively shrink to allow cerebrospinal fluid to wash through the tissue. Without sufficient deep sleep, these metabolic byproducts, including beta amyloid, accumulate and can disrupt neural function and long-term cognitive health. The preservation of memory is therefore inextricably linked to the quality and quantity of sleep the individual obtains consistently. The architecture of sleep changes as one ages, often becoming more fragmented and lighter, which poses a significant challenge to this restorative process. However, this degradation is not entirely inevitable and can be mitigated through specific behavioral protocols that stabilize the sleep-wake cycle. The individual must view sleep not as a passive shutdown, but as an active metabolic phase that requires preparation and protection. This perspective shifts the focus from merely spending time in bed to optimizing the physiological conditions that permit the brain to enter those critical restorative stages. The consistency of sleep timing, regulating the thermal environment, and managing light exposure all play pivotal roles in signaling the brain that it is safe to enter deep slumber. One powerful tool for those who struggle with sleep consistency or need to recover from a night of poor rest is non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR. This protocol involves guiding the brain and body into a state of profound relaxation without actually falling asleep, often through body scans or specific breathing patterns. Huberman posits that NSDR can help replenish dopamine levels and accelerate neuroplasticity by facilitating the relaxation of the nervous system. Implementing a brief session of NSDR during the day can serve as a buffer against stress and fatigue, allowing the individual to reset their autonomic nervous system. This practice is particularly valuable for older adults who may find it difficult to sustain a single 8-hour block of sleep at night. A practical scenario for integrating this involves setting aside 20 minutes in the early afternoon for an NSDR session or yoga nidra practice. The individual lies down in a quiet, dim room and listens to a guided script that systematically relaxes the body, moving attention from the periphery to the core. This deliberate disengagement from sensory input allows the brain to switch off the alertness systems that have been active throughout the morning. Unlike a nap, which might leave one feeling groggy if it lasts too long, this controlled state of rest preserves sleep pressure for the night while providing immediate cognitive refreshment. It serves as a manual break for the sympathetic nervous system, reducing the cumulative stress load that often interferes with nocturnal sleep. There's a misconception that older adults simply need less sleep, but neuroscience suggests that they still require the same amount, even if they struggle to generate it. The inability to sleep is often a failure of the regulatory systems rather than a reduced need for recovery. Relying on chemical sedatives or alcohol to induce sleep is a counterproductive strategy that many fall into. While these substances may hasten the onset of unconsciousness, they severely disrupt the architecture of sleep, often suppressing the very rapid eye movement, REM, and deep sleep cycles required for memory consolidation and waste clearance. The sleep obtained under the influence of sedatives is biologically distinct from natural sleep and fails to provide the same neuroprotective benefits. Furthermore, the timing of food intake and exercise significantly impacts the ability to access deep sleep states. Eating large meals too close to bedtime diverts blood flow and energy toward digestion, increasing core body temperature at a time when it needs to drop to facilitate sleep entry. Similarly, intense exercise performed late in the evening can elevate cortisol and adrenaline, keeping the body in a state of high alert that fights against the natural circadian dip. The individual who prioritizes brain health creates a buffer zone before bed, free from intense stimulation, bright lights, and heavy digestion. This preparation allows the natural cascade of melatonin and other sleep-promoting hormones to function without interference. The relationship between anxiety and sleep creates a bidirectional loop where poor sleep increases anxiety, and anxiety disrupts sleep. Breaking this cycle often requires a cognitive approach that decatastrophizes wakefulness. If the individual wakes up in the middle of the night, remaining calm and using relaxation techniques is far more beneficial than lying in bed worrying about the lost sleep. The stress of not sleeping is often more damaging than the sleep loss itself, as it spikes cortisol levels that further antagonize the sleep mechanism. Accepting the wakefulness while keeping the body at rest allows for a higher probability of falling back asleep or at least obtaining some restorative benefit from the resting state. Ultimately, sleep is the foundation upon which all other cognitive strategies rest. No amount of brain training, nutritional optimization, or physical exercise can fully compensate for a chronic deficit in sleep-dependent neural processing. By treating sleep as a vital biological discipline rather than a luxury, the individual protects the structural integrity of the brain. The rigorous defense of sleep quality is perhaps the single most effective intervention for extending cognitive span and preventing premature decline. Do I treat my rest as a biological necessity or a negotiating chip? The circadian anchor and photonic signaling, the synchronization of the body's internal clocks to the external environment, is governed primarily by light, which serves as the central timekeeper for every cell in the body. Andrew Huberman identifies the viewing of morning sunlight as one of the most potent behaviors for mental and physical health. This is not merely about vitamin D, but concerns the activation of specific intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that communicate directly with the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. When these cells detect the specific quality and angle of low solar angle sunlight, they trigger a precise release of cortisol, known as the cortisol awakening response. This pulse sets the rhythm for the entire day, enhancing alertness, mood, and immune function while simultaneously setting a timer for the release of melatonin some 12 to 14 hours later. For the aging brain, the precision of this circadian rhythm often begins to drift, leading to fragmented sleep, mood instability, and hormonal imbalances. By deliberately anchoring the biological clock with bright light exposure early in the day, the individual reinforces the boundary between day and night, ensuring that alertness peaks when it is needed and rest occurs when it is appropriate. This practice is entirely behavioral and requires no equipment, yet powerfully modulates the neurochemistry of the brain. The consistency of this signal is paramount. Even on cloudy days, the photon density of natural light far exceeds that of indoor artificial lighting. Providing this strong signal to the brain helps to override the tendency for the internal rhythm to become dampened or desynchronized with age. A daily routine incorporating this principle involves stepping outside within the first hour of waking for 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the brightness of the sky. The individual should not wear sunglasses during this time, although prescription lenses are permissible to ensure that sufficient light energy reaches the retina. This simple act of walking or sitting outside serves as a powerful neurobiological signal that communicates start-to-the-body systems. It creates a robust separation between the sleep state and the waking state, clearing out the residual grogginess often felt in the morning. Additionally, combining this light exposure with forward ambulation or walking generates optic flow, which further quiets the amygdala and reduces anxiety circuits in the brain. Conversely, the mismanagement of light in the evening constitutes a significant threat to cognitive health. The same retinal cells that signal wakefulness in the morning are exquisitely sensitive to artificial light, particularly in the blue spectrum during the hours between dusk and dawn. Exposure to bright overhead lights or screen glare late at night suppresses melatonin production and confuses the circadian clock, signaling to the brain that it is still daytime. This disruption not only impairs the ability to fall asleep, but also degrades the quality of the sleep that follows, reducing the time spent in the restorative stages. The individual who protects their circadian rhythm dims the lights in their environment after sunset and places light sources lower in the visual field to mimic the natural fading of the day. The impact of circadian disruption extends beyond sleep to affect metabolism, hormonal regulation, and emotional resilience. When the internal clock is out of sync with the external world, the body operates in a state of chronic physiological stress. Hormones are released at inappropriate times, digestion is compromised, and the brain struggles to maintain stable energy levels. For the older adult, whose homeostatic reserves may be lower, these disruptions can have amplified effects on daily functioning and long-term health. Reestablishing a strong circadian rhythm acts as a systemic reset button that aligns these disparate biological processes. Some may argue that their schedule does not permit morning light viewing, or that they are naturally night owls who do not benefit from early rhythms. However, the biological machinery of the human species is universally tuned to the solar day, and while there is some genetic variance in chronotypes, the fundamental requirement for light-dark contrast remains. Ignoring this biological imperative often leads to a reliance on stimulants to wake up and sedatives to fall asleep, a chemical roller coaster that erodes brain health over time. The goal is not to force an unnatural schedule, but to provide the brain with the clearest possible signals about where the body exists in time. The viewing of sunlight in the late afternoon or around sunset also plays a role in this system. Huberman notes that viewing low solar angle light in the evening can mitigate some of the negative effects of subsequent artificial light exposure. It signals to the visual system that the day is ending, serving as a second anchor point for the circadian clock. This bookending of the day with natural light creates a solid temporal framework within which the body can operate efficiently. It is a zero-cost intervention that leverages the biology of the eye to regulate the chemistry of the brain. By respecting the power of light as a biological signal, The individual harnesses a fundamental mechanism of life to support cognitive longevity. The eyes are essentially extensions of the brain, and what they perceive dictates the hormonal and neurotransmitter state of the entire organism. Controlling the light environment is, therefore, a direct way of controlling brain function. It shifts the management of aging from a passive experience to an active alignment with the natural world. What signals am I sending my body about the time of day? Metabolic vitality and the final synthesis, the preservation of brain health, is intimately tied to the metabolic health of the body, specifically through the mechanism of blood flow and the release of growth factors. The brain is a voracious consumer of oxygen and glucose, and its function is dependent on the integrity of the vascular system that supplies these nutrients. Andrew Huberman and other experts emphasize the critical role of Zone 2 cardiovascular exercise, steady-state effort where one can maintain a conversation, but with some difficulty in maintaining this vascular network. This type of movement encourages the growth of new capillaries and improves the efficiency of mitochondrial function, ensuring that neurons receive the fuel they need to operate and repair. Furthermore, resistance training triggers the release of osteocalcin from bones, a hormone that travels to the brain and supports memory and hippocampal function. The integration of movement is not merely about muscle or heart health, but is a direct intervention for neural preservation. Exercise stimulates the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, often described as fertilizer for the brain, which supports the survival of existing neurons and the growth of new synapses. This chemical environment creates the fertile ground upon which neuroplasticity can take root. Without the metabolic signal of movement, the brain lacks the necessary growth factors to support the structural changes induced by learning and focus. Therefore, a sedentary lifestyle is a direct signal to the brain to conserve resources and reduce neural complexity. A comprehensive protocol for later life involves synthesizing these elements, focus, sleep, light, and movement, into a cohesive lifestyle. The individual who engages in a morning walk gets the benefits of sunlight, optic flow, and Zone 2 exercise simultaneously. This stacking of behaviors maximizes efficiency and reinforces the positive feedback loops between the different systems. For instance, the physical fatigue from exercise improves sleep depth, while better sleep improves the focus required for neuroplasticity. The interconnectedness of these mechanisms means that improvement in one area often lifts the entire system. The synthesis of these 10 psychological and physiological keys, ranging from the granular management of acetylcholine and adenosine to the macroscopic regulation of circadian rhythms and vascular health, provides a robust framework for aging. It moves the conversation from genetics, which cannot be changed, to protocols, which can be enacted daily. The brain is not a static vessel that slowly leaks its contents, but a dynamic organ that responds to the demands placed upon it. By demanding focus, prioritizing recovery, and respecting the biological need for light and movement, the individual constructs a defense against decline. Ultimately, the key to a sharper brain in later life lies in the refusal to seek purely passive comfort. The mechanisms that sustain youthfulness in the brain are triggered by effort, contrast, and rhythm. Whether it is the friction of learning a new skill, the discipline of a sleep schedule, or the physical effort of a long hike, the brain thrives on challenge and regularity. This approach empowers the individual to become the architect of their own cognitive future, proving that while time moves forward, the mind can remain vibrant, adaptive, and keenly alert. What daily action am I taking to prove to my brain that it is still needed?